Hey there. It's so good to see you. I've returned from, it feels like a very, very long time. And I can give you a pretty long list of things I was trying to do, but most importantly, I actually created a studio here at my new place. I was moving into a new apartment. And I created a studio so that I can make ASMR videos for you on a weekly basis. Kind of how I started, but of course things are just so hectic. I'm just catching up now. So I hope that you're doing well. And I'm very excited because this is going to be a longer, in-depth historical view of the sort of Near East, Middle East, Palestine, Israel, during the time around 0 to 50 AD, during the time of Jesus. And I'm very excited to talk in depth about the culture and the geography during that time. It's a very fascinating story. So, with that all said, let's go ahead and take a seat over here and look at this map in more detail. So, that all said, thank you so much for your patience and your continued support, and I'm really glad to be back as well. So, alright, let's take a look. So, today we're going to look at a map of the Near East in what is current day Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and we're going to explore the period of 4 BC to 30 AD. This also includes the period of Herod, which is 40 to 4 BC. So at this time, it was ruled by a Roman vassal whose name was Herod the Great. And he was renowned for building projects. However, also his ruthlessness and arbitrary actions. So when he passed, his kingdom was divided between his 3 sons. So after his death, he split up the kingdom into 3 territories, as you can see with the colors here. And you can also see the highways, which were used to travel between the towns, with these checked lines here. During this period, the leader of this region was Pontius Pilate, and the Roman capital here is actually Caesarea. I think this pronunciation. We'll explore that as we move along here. So this was settled for thousands of years, and at this time there was a very Hellenistic influence. So let's start by exploring each of the cities and the geographical features in this map. So, to begin, we have the Salt Sea, which is here. And this is also known as the Dead Sea. But at this time, it was known by several different names, including the Eastern Sea, because it was the eastern side of the empire here. It had about, or it currently has about 26% salt content, which makes it the world's most saline body of water. So, during the ancient times, salt was a very important commodity in the region, and it earned a lot of wealth for this region. Next, we have Idumea. And Idumea is also known as Edom, and it was located between Israel and modern Jordan. So, this kingdom actually was much larger, but they were pushed west by nomadic tribes. As you can see here, the Nabateans. And they established their kingdom in what used to be Edom. So the kingdom was pushed directly over here. And in fact, Herod was born in 73 BC in Idumea. So next, we go to Masada, which is a fortification, ancient one, and it's located on a large plateau, or a mesa. And it's overlooking the desert, actually here. And the Dead Sea as well. So on this mountain around here, Herod the Great built 2 palaces for himself. And that's actually today one of Israel's most popular tourist attractions. So it was also a place of refuge for Herod to escape revolt as well. So let's move on to the Philistia, to the region. There's actually a group of people who arrived in the Levant, and they came during a time when cities and civilizations in the Middle East and Greece were collapsing. Much of what we know comes from the Egyptians and the Assyrians, as well as stories in the Bible. So, it's stated that they originate in Crete originally. So, they were at this time 5 main cities, which was Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. There's Gaza, excuse me. Gath, I'm not sure where that is on the map here. It doesn't look like it's on this map. But they were known to be a tall and clean-shaven people. Back 3,000 years ago, there was constant warfare between Philistia and Israel. In fact, they killed Saul and his sons, according to legend. Also of legend is the Goliath, which was killed by David, which is a story in the Bible as well. So this group of people did not leave any texts, so almost all of what we know comes from the people who came in contact with them. And in fact, because of that, their name has a negative context. So a Philistine is somebody who is warlike or doesn't appreciate art or culture. So there have been attempts to find archaeological evidence, but around the 6th century BC, they disappear from history. And the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the region and destroyed several cities here. So actually, Ashkelon was destroyed. So now we're going to move to Judea. And the early history of Judea is uncertain. The biblical account states that the kingdom of Judah, which is in the northern section, along with the northern kingdom, was the successor to united Israel. But the united monarchy theory is actually disputed by scholars. So this region is very central to the Torah. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are said to be buried at Hebron here. So this meaning, culturally, this meant the area surrounding Jerusalem. And eventually it, around this time, became a Roman province. So this area was also the center of one of the biggest Roman uprisings in about 66 AD, so about 30 years after this map was created. So during this time, Jerusalem was the center of Jewish culture, and Jews would go on a pilgrimage, as you can see with these roads coming up and down for religious pilgrimage at least once a year. It was also a center of culture, economy, administration. Now let's go ahead and go to explore Jerusalem. And this was the center for the Jews at this time. And the Jewish people would go on pilgrimage once a year. It was also the economic, administrative, and cultural center of the area. The Roman administration, which was controlled by Romans at this time. And that was in a city close by called Caesarea, as we've mentioned. In the first century, Jerusalem became the birthplace of early Christianity. Jesus was crucified in the city of Jerusalem in 30 AD, so this is during this time. About 37 BC, before, which is actually included in this map, but King Herod reconstructed the Second Temple and transformed the city in terms of buildings. No visitor seeing Jerusalem for the first time could fail to be impressed by the visual splendor. The long, difficult descent from Jericho here to the holy city. As you rounded the Mount of Olives and saw the sight of a vista like few others in the world. The temple in Jerusalem stood high above the old city of David, at the center of a gigantic white stone platform. A high, thick, gray stone wall circled the city, and it had been damaged, repaired, enlarged over the centuries. In this period of time, it was about 4 miles in circumference, and brought about 25,000 people into an area, about a square mile here. So along the intervals, there was many different towns and customs. Now let's come over here to Perea. So in the current day, this is an area east of Jordan, where John the Baptist preached repentance. The people at this time in Perea were mostly Jewish, and together with Galilee, it formed the Tetrarchy of Herod Antipas, as I mentioned, one of the areas for the sons of Herod. So Jesus, if the accounts are true, would pass through this territory to avoid the Samaria, which was known as kind of a more rough area. So now we're gonna move along here. This is the city of Machaerus, or Machaerus, has different pronunciation, but it is a fortified hilltop palace. It's in Jordan, current-day Jordan. And it's on the other side of the Dead Sea, as you can see here. It was the location of the imprisonment and execution of John the Baptist, but it's also the setting for Herod the Great, his son, Tetrarch Herod Antipas, his second wife, Princess Herodias, and her daughter. It was actually destroyed by Pompey's general Gabinius in 57 BC, but was rebuilt by Herod the Great to use as a military base to safeguard his territories east of the Jordan River. So during this time, Herod Antipas ruled from 4 BC to 39 AD. So around the 1st century was when John the Baptist was in this region. This then passed into Roman control. However, Jewish rebels in 66 AD, during the First Jewish Revolt, took control. But then the Romans took back control, and so Machaerus. Another one you might notice here is Philadelphia, which might sound familiar. This was a city 30 miles southeast of Sardis in Asia Minor. It was to be an open door for Greek culture. And actually, in 17 AD, Philadelphia was destroyed by an earthquake and later rebuilt by Emperor Tiberius. During this time, Philadelphia specialized in textile and leather production. Interestingly, many cities had the name Philadelphia, but this is one of the, or generally agreed to be the one listed among the 7 churches written by John in the book of Revelation. So, the city has a really big history of earthquakes. So, anyway, moving on here to Jericho. Jericho, or Ephraim, is one of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And at this time, it was located in the wild, uncultivated hill country 13 miles to the northeast of Jerusalem. And it was perched on with a conspicuous view, or extensive view, of the central towns of the Jordan Valley. So it's a gulch, essentially, that runs easterly-westerly direction. And it was part of the pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So now we're going to move to Apollonia, which is over on the coast here. And Apollonia was a city of Macedonia, through which Paul and Silas passed their way from Philippi. And it's about 30 Roman miles from Amphipolis and Thessalonica. So, just another coastal city in the Roman kingdom, essentially. Now we're going to move to Samaria. Samaria was south of Galilee, which is up north here. This was a mixed population, which resulted from political transfers. Essentially, the Jews they did not consider them to be real Jews. The Samaritans worshipped at Mount Gerizim, and they considered it sacred. They recognized as Holy Scripture only the 5 books of Moses, and the textual form they used was different from that in use among the Jews at the time. So there's definitely a relationship, but some essential differences as well. So one of the major population centers of Samaria was Shechem. And Shechem was a commercial center due to its position located, as you can see here, these checkered lines. A lot of trade routes ran through here along the kingdom. It was a part of the trade routes included local grapes, olives, wheat, livestock, and pottery. This was during the Middle Bronze Age and late Hellenistic period. It had been a long time a Canaanite settlement, and of course there's a long complicated history with Abraham as well here. Next we have the town of Sychar. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but many have argued these are the same places. But many recent excavations have shown that these are different cities. For example, the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim in 128 BC was destroyed, as well as the city. Also we have here Jacob's well, which is a rock well that is associated for millennia with Jacob. It's very close to Shechem, as you can see, but it has been situated within different churches built over the same site. Jewish, Samaritan, Christian, and Muslim traditions all associate the well with Jacob. And it's said that he camped here before the city, and they say this was the place where he camped. Next, we have Salim, or Aenon, and it is the site mentioned by the Gospel of John as the place where John was baptized after his encounter with Jesus. So, Aenon is means spring or natural fountain, and it is mentioned in the Gospel of John. However, this is currently a place in the Jordan Valley where it's about 7 miles from Scythopolis, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. So this is the springs of Wadi Raria. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that as well, but as you can see here, some question marks about whether this is the same place or a different place. So now we're here to Scythopolis. And it's played a very important role, geographically speaking, because it's the junction of the Jordan River Valley and the Jezreel Valley. It is the biblical account of the battle of the Israelites against the Philistines on Mount Shelboa, as you can see here. So you can see here now we have Decapolis. And this was a group of 10 cities on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire. So they formed this group because of their language and culture, location, and political status. And they were an autonomous city-state dependent on Rome. But they're sometimes described as a league of cities, although many scholars believe they were never formally organized as a political unit. So this was the center of Greek and Roman culture, which was an area mostly populated by Semitic people, Nabateans, as I spoke about earlier, Judeans, and Aramaeans. So most of this is in current day Jordan, but Scythopolis, as I mentioned over here, and North Damascus, which we haven't gotten to. There in Israel and in Syria. So under the Roman rule, the city of the Decapolis were not included in the Herodian kingdom, but they were allowed to have considerable political autonomy under Roman protection. So each city minted its own coins, and many of them say free or sovereign, autonomous on them. However, the Romans left their cultural stamp on all of the cities. Each one was eventually rebuilt. The Roman-style grid street, based on a central cardo or sort of city market. So they built many temples and public buildings, and a small open-air Templar facade called a calibe, which was unique to the region. So this region benefited strongly from strong commercial ties from a network of Roman roads. So one of those cities that was included was Harassa, which is known as Jerash, and it was one of the cities in the league. So next we have the capital, or the Roman capital of the region, which is known as Caesarea, and this is was built by Herod the Great in 25 to 13 BC as a major port. So it was the major Roman center for this entire region. So it The city contained one of the largest ports in the entire kingdom, which is called Sebastos. Markets and wide roads, baths, temples to Rome and Augustus, and imposing public buildings. Herod built his palace on a promontory jutting out into the sea with a decorative pool surrounded by stoas. Every 5 years, the city hosted major sports competitions, gladiator games, and theater overlooking the sea. When Judea became a Roman province in 6 CE, Caesarea replaced Jerusalem as a civilian and military capital and became the residence of the governors. The city is the location of the discovery of the Pilate stone, which is the only archaeological item that mentions the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, who we know was involved with the trial of Jesus. So it's likely that Pilate used this as a base and only went to Jerusalem as needed. So the harbor was one of the largest outside of Athens and had a medieval town still visible today. A citadel surrounded by the sea and the remains of a second church. So it's actually estimated at this time the population was 125,000 people in an area of about 3.7 square kilometers. So here we have Trachonitis, which is also spelled Lejat, the Lejat. And it's a lava field in southern Syria, which spans about 900 square kilometers. And this area was conquered as well by the Roman Empire, about 24 BCE. At that time, it was inhabited by nomadic cattle herders who lived in caves and depressions here. So Herod the Great controlled this region, and he built the town of Bethera, but in this area. So the inhabitants of this region gradually became settled and even gained exemption from taxations. The Romans built a road that passed through the center of Trachonitis and connected with the Roman road system in Syria, as you can see here. Several towns actually sprang up between the 1st and 4th century. So many of these settlements had theaters, colonnades, temples, and this is the town of Zarava, which was one of the political centers. So many of the early inhabitants were Nabatean Arabs at that time. So, very interesting, complicated region. You can see Batanea. In the 1st century, the land was acquired by Herod the Great. And on his death in 4 BCE, he passed it to Philip. So some have referred to it as the Tetrarch of Batanea. And the capital of this region was Caesarea Philippi, which was up here. So this was established and once again annexed to the Roman province of Syria later on. So now we also have here Auranitis. And there's a lot of ghost towns that exist in this area. Some of them constructed on basalt and called the giant cities of Bashan. So this area was one of the Greco-Roman regions. And this was part of, again, the Tetrarchy of Philippi. And eventually, he was the son of Herod the Great and Cleopatra of Jerusalem. We also have Kanata, and it's one of the earliest cities in the region. And it is evidenced in the Bible as Kenath. So many argue whether this is the modern city of El Karak or Kanawat. So there are actually many cities that have this name. And so it's quite difficult to determine which one is actually the correct one, due to the difficulty in attaining archaeological evidence in the region. Now we have Galilee, and this is where Jesus was reportedly from, in the town of Nazareth. This is the northern territory, and outside of the towns of Sepphoris and Tiberias, it was mostly a agricultural and country area. In fact, the Lake Gennesaret, I'm sure I'm messing up the name there, is famous for its fishing. And Jesus is said to have found his first disciples among the fishermen here in Galilee. So this was surrounded by a number of Greek cities, Ptolemais and others. And there was also a group of 10 Greek towns close by here, as you know, the Decapolis. But the rest of the area was Jewish. So, to begin with, we have Nazareth, which is the largest city in the northern district of Israel. So it's predominantly Arab currently, but it was described as the childhood home of Jesus. So, as such, it is the center of Christian pilgrimage. Many shrines commemorating the biblical accounts. So this was also the home village of Mary, so the sign of the Annunciation, which is the when the angel told her she would give birth to Jesus. Now, interestingly, although it is mentioned in the New Testament, there's no extant non-biblical references to Nazareth until about 200 CE, when it was mentioned by Sextus Julius Africanus, the Roman. So they spoke of a village of Nazara, which was located in Judea. So it's safe to assume that might be it. So although there is controversy over Nazareth, it just more likely reflects the lack of prominence of Galilee and Judea in general. However, that said, they calculate, there's been some recent archaeological digs here, and they did discover I believe it was a house. Now, there are sources that mention a public bath in the region, which would have served fairly important functions societally. And the population, they said, it was about 500 to 1,500 people. So not a large town in today's world. Next we have the town of Bethlehem, which was uncovered in 2012, actually, archaeologically speaking. So it was a region that had grain, wine, and other goods. It is also considered a hill country. It's a very fertile land, but it's described as the city of David, and it's the place where Rachel died. So, according to the Bible, it was the home of Jesse, the father of the king of David, and the area where a lot of these biblical events are taking place. It has about 25,000 people currently, so not large today, but it is an important Jewish holy site as well. So, in certain parts of the Bible, they do identify Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus. However, again, there's always historical controversy with regards to that, but for our purposes, we'll just go ahead with that. And now we can see the Sea of Galilee. So this is the lowest freshwater lake on Earth, and the second lowest lake in the world after the Dead Sea, which is a salt water lake. It's about 53 kilometers and about 141 feet deep. But its main source is the Jordan River, which flows through it from north to south, as you can see here, the River Jordan. So the Sea of Galilee has gone through several changes of hand, but this was considered the site of one of the first permanent human settlements in the world, from a time predating the Neolithic Revolution. So as you can see, there are towns surrounding the entire lake. And you can imagine a lake culture, Greeks, Romans, and flourishing towns, including Tiberias, which we mentioned earlier as one of the commercial centers, and Hippos, and Gerasa. And there actually was an impressive commercial center here, which, according to Romans, about 230 boats regularly working the lake. So they actually found one such boat, which was called the Jesus boat, in about 1986. So, in the New Testament, much of the ministry of Jesus occurs on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, and that continuous development of settlements and villages provided plenty of trade and ferrying. So you can imagine Jesus going back and forth along this boat, meeting fishermen and sharing ideas. So, one of the episodes is supposed to have taken place on the hills surrounding here. Many of his miracles are said to have occurred here, including walking on water, the miraculous catch of the fish, and feeding 5,000 people. So it's the setting for his post-resurrection appearance. Interestingly, after the Romans banned the Jews following the revolts there, the Jewish culture shifted to the region of Galilee, especially to the city of Tiberias, which is here. And it was actually this region that the Jewish Talmud was compiled. So, another interesting town along this lake is the town of Magdala, which might sound familiar, and that might refer to the follower of Jesus, Mary Magdalene. And it's assumed that her name means Mary from Magdala. So there isn't historical information to support this, but it's assumed that this is what it was referring to. And apparently Jesus landed here along this lake in Magdala as well. In the Talmud, it is known as the Magdala Nunaya, which means the Tower of Fishes. So it was a place literally for processing fish. And it's still a small village there, though the modern Israeli municipality of Migdal extends to this area. So, this area was a very important city during the Roman times, and ultimately Tiberias, which was built up by Herod Antipas, kind of ruined the economy of Magdala, and took control of the area, really. So, had some administrative apparatus and personnel, but not quite the same. Next we have Phoenicia. And this was a Mediterranean civilization that originated in the Levant. And there are arguments about how far the kingdom extended. However, it is part of coastal areas of modern-day Lebanon and northern Israel, as in western Syria. So, it did extend even towards Carthage in later times. So, Phoenicia was a major export, especially in Tyre, which created the cloth dye purple, Tyrian purple, from the Murex mollusk. It's a snail that they would grind up to make the color purple, which was a royal color, as you may recall if you know your Roman togas, for example, Caesarian togas especially. And it's a major Canaanite port town. So they were organized in city-states, sort of similarly to the Greeks, Athens and Sparta, etc. So they were each politically independent. So we can see here Tyre, Sidon up north here, Arwad, which is not on here, Berytus, Byblos. Not on this map is Carthage as well. So the Phoenicians themselves may have not viewed themselves as one cultural unit. So they might have just been different tribes of people, essentially. Might have been how they viewed it. Now around 1050 BC, the alphabet was used for writing Phoenician, and it became one of the most widely used writing systems. And the alphabet they created gave rise to the Greek alphabet, which in turn gave rise to the Latin alphabet, which is very familiar today. They were, at that time, the greatest traders of their time and owed much of their prosperity to trade. At first, they traded with Greeks, wood, slaves, glass, and powdered Tyrian purple. So, next we have Phoenicia. And this is a Semitic-speaking Mediterranean civilization that includes coastal Syria and west of the Fertile Crescent. Scholars agree that it was centered in what is coastal areas of modern-day Lebanon, but of course it is up and down the coast here. So some suggest it was actually far south towards Ashkelon, which we've mentioned earlier as well. But essentially it spread between 1500 BC and 300 BC, especially. So this was a civilization that specialized in trade, and their famous commodity was based here in Tyre. It was called Tyrian purple, and it's made from the Murex mollusk, which is just a type of snail. And they essentially, used it to create this purple dye, which was very popular in ancient Greece. So each of these Phoenician cities, here's, for example, Tyre, Sidon, also Byblos, Carthage, Mogador. These were all almost like Greek city-states. They were independently organized, but culturally sort of related. Of course, there's no archaeological evidence to view that these Phoenicians saw themselves as one political unit. So, in about 1050 BC, a Phoenician alphabet was used, and it became, especially because of the trading aspect, it spread and was used to give rise to the Greek alphabet, which in turn gave rise to the Latin alphabet, which we know today. So they were among the greatest traders of their time, and they usually trade wood, slaves, glass, the powdered Tyrian purple, and essentially the Phoenicians sailed along the shores here, and the two cultures rarely clashed, the Greeks and the Phoenicians, but mainly in the Sicilian Wars, that's where things came to a headway. So this violet-purple dye is from a gland of this sea snail, and it was once profusely available in the coastal waters of the eastern Mediterranean Sea, but it was exploited to local extinction, which is quite sad. They were able to find pottery and things of that nature to indicate that they were using this to create this dye. The second production city for Phoenicia was in Mogador, which is over in modern-day Morocco. Also, the brilliant textiles and Phoenician glass were another export. One other interesting fact here about the Phoenicians is that it's written, the Greek historian Strabo and Herodotus, as well as modern scholars, believe that the Phoenicians originated in modern-day Bahrain. So the people of Tyre and South Lebanon currently have long maintained Persian Gulf origins. So there's mixed evidence to support this. So that said, it is part of the tradition. So this city here, Tyre, it's one of actually the oldest continually inhabited cities in the world. Though in medieval times it was just a tiny population. So it was one of the Phoenician metropolises, and the birthplace of Carthage's founder, Dido. So it's currently, people do live there now, and it's many World Heritage Sites. There are some Arabian authors that claim that Tyre was the birthplace of Euclid, who's the father of geometry. So during the Roman times, Tyre was allowed to keep its independence, and it was sort of had privileged status as a free city, and it maintained much of its commercial importance from this dye. The production of linen as well, and garum, which is the fish sauce that the Romans loved, like the ketchup of the Roman era. So it was sort of as you can see, these roads here leading up and over to Damascus here. And this sort of made it the port of Damascus, which was one of the most important cities at the time. And it linked up into these Roman roads. So it was actually an important meeting point in the Silk Road. So as you can imagine, a lot of trade depended on this coastal region here. So they do say that Jesus visited this region, and they drank from a spring in that region. So it does have a connection there as well. So another really interesting feature here is the Ladder of Tyrus. And this is a steep road cut in steps which connected these territories. So the capes jutting westward into the sea from the ridge run parallel to the general line of the coast. And they're very high, about 300 feet. So they had steps that were cut into the white rock here. And that was identified as the ladder. And actually the area from which the snails that I mentioned earlier, the purple dye, were collected from here and all the way up. So, that said, there are varying locations mentioned for this as well. So, it may not be in just this location. It could have been some others that were mentioned. So, there's controversy there, as there is with a lot of these locations. So now let's move up here to the Idumea. And they were a semi-nomadic Greek tribe. And scholars do identify them with the Arabic tradition. However, there are some that believe they were Aramaean people. And they rose to power in the aftermath of the decline of the Seleucids in the 2nd century BC. And they had most of their base here at the base of Mount Lebanon, and appears to they have gone into what is modern-day Israel and Syria as well. So this was, the center of it was really in the kingdom of Ptolemy. So it was kind of changed hands throughout the times. It is only mentioned once in the Bible. However, this region is mentioned many times by Romans and pagan, quote-unquote, writers, such as Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Cicero. Josephus as well described them. So to the Romans, they were known as a predatory people, and they were well known for their skill in archery. So they played a role in the defense of Jerusalem, and actually at some point, I believe in about 103 to 76, they were forcibly converted to Judaism. So, very interesting. Now we have here Abilene. So the limits of this region are nowhere exactly defined. They say it's the slopes of over, really this entire region here up to Damascus. And some have even pushed the borders towards Galilee and Batanea, as we saw earlier. And this was a region fertilized by the river Barada, or Abana, and about 18 miles from Damascus. So it was a separate Etrurian kingdom until about 37 AD, which you can see here. Became a bit obscure following that point, but in 37 AD it was granted to Agrippa I. So it was administered by Romans for the next 100 or 200 years there. Now we see here, I had already been pointing at it, but Mount Hermon. And this is a mountain cluster that straddles the border between Syria and Lebanon. And the highest point is about 9,000 feet. So on the top of it currently is a UN buffer zone, so it's the highest manned UN position in the world. And there are many sacred buildings along this. Mountain, made of hewn blocks of stone on the summit. So it's actually the highest temple in the ancient world. So various temples can be found in villages on the slopes of Mount Hermon. Next we have Damascus. And Damascus Damascus has been occupied since about 6300 BC, though there is some evidence to support even around 9000 BC. There was people settling there. So it was about till the second millennium that was when the first major settlement began in Damascus. And it's always been an important city. Through Mesopotamia, the Aramaeans, 11th century BC, all the way really to the first millennium. There's many kingdoms here. And the Aramaeans is sort of the center of their kingdom. So it was constructed with canals and tunnels, which sort of maximized the efficiency of the Barada River, as I mentioned earlier. And that same network was improved by the Romans and the Umayyad Caliphate as well. So that still forms the basis for the water system of the old part of the city to this day. So the Aramaeans eventually turned Damascus into an outpost of a loose federation of Aramaean tribes. So this rural region was really full of people. And then it was incorporated into the Decapolis, which I mentioned is the League of Cities. And the Romans incorporated them into that. So it was a rectangular shape designed to the Roman fashion. So it still today has this north-south axis, the main road. So there was a monumental gate there as well, which still survives. In 23 BC, Herod the Great was gifted this land, and they say that eventually when he died, they reverted to Syria. And was given to Herod Philip and to Syria on his death later. So actually during this time of this map. So it's really about 6 days journey on foot from Jerusalem, northeast of Mount Hermon, as we mentioned, and 50 miles from the Mediterranean coast. So this to here is about 50 miles. So it's walkable within a couple days, 6 days. The city's location is at a river at a crossroads, so it had prosperity and importance, as well as being part of the Silk Road as well. So it is close to the desert, but it has ample supplies of drinking water from the two rivers, so it allows for the region to support vineyards and crops, fruits, grains, nuts, cotton, wool, silk, olives, and tobacco. So that river is the primary source of the Barada today. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it very badly. So basically there are gardens and orchards surrounding this whole region. So in the Bible, at least, it was first mentioned in connection with Abraham's rescue of Lot. That said, it's a very important city during this time. So now let's go ahead and we sort of looked over this whole map here. And so we're going to go look at a little closer up at Jerusalem, as well as Herod's temple. You can see here's Jerusalem during the Roman period. And you can see Zion Gate, which was one of the 8 gates in the wall of the old city of Jerusalem. So you can see here the Tyropone. I'm probably mispronouncing this, but it's called the Valley of the Cheesemakers. It's a rugged ravine, and it separates Mount Moriah from Mount Zion to the Valley of the Aenon over here. And essentially, it's almost a plain here, and it was a ordinary means of communication. There's this area between the royal palace on Zion and the temple. The Valley of Edom, which is actually where all the rubbish from the city was thrown, dumped and burned. So it was a deep and narrow ravine with steep rocky sides to the south and west of Jerusalem. So, sort of separated Mount Zion from the hill of, as they say, the hill of the evil counsel. And it is, where they collected the waste, solid filth at that time. Interesting. The upper city. This is the hill where you can see here Herod's palace, and it has been inhabited for many, many millennia. So during Herod's reign, it was inhabited. It had been actually uninhabited before Herod, and then they built up things there and became the residential quarter of the Jerusalem aristocracy and priestly families, surrounded by porticos and essentially built into a royal hall. So it was one of the largest buildings in the Roman Empire. Then he built a citadel, which had a very central location. It was well protected to the western side of the city, so people could see his marvelous palace and all of the beautiful towers that surround it. So the largest of these towers was the Faisal Tower, and the most beautiful was the Mariamna Tower. So the largest of these towers, Tower of Faisal, is 145 feet high and named after his brother. The Tower Mariamna, who was named after his wife, whom unfortunately he had actually murdered. It was 74 feet and decorated. That said, there's the Hippicus Tower, which was named after a friend of his, and that is about 132 feet. When Titus destroyed most of Jerusalem, he spared this fortress, actually. So nothing remains of these towers, and a citadel named David's Tower stands on the spot of Faisal's Tower, the Sultan's Pool. So this palace was constructed on a platform about 1,000 feet and 180 feet east to west. So it consisted of two main buildings, each with a banquet hall, bath, and accommodation for 100 guests. And it was surrounded by groves of trees, canals, and ponds, studded with bronze fountains. This is where the praetorium of the trial of Jesus was located, and is the official residence of the Roman governors when they came to Jerusalem during the festivals. Unfortunately, nothing remains of its construction. So let's go ahead and just zoom in on this last section here, the actual palace itself, as we can see here. So as you can see, this is Herod's temple here, and it was split into a couple areas. So first we have the court of the women, which was the area that the women were permitted to enter in the temples of Jerusalem. So it served both men and women equally, but balconies were installed for the women to stand upon, and they would stand in this court, and the men were on the outside of the courtyard and on the rampart, and they would come to conduct themselves with inappropriately, as men do, and each other's company. So they needed to be closer to the altar where the offerings were being sacrificed, and they would mingle with the women. So because of this, the sages instituted that the women should sit on the outside and the men on the inside, and they should essentially separate them, and the women would look upon the men. There was a special wooden platform which would be built for the king's seat to read the Torah to the people. The court of the Gentiles was next to the porch, and it was sort of surrounded by the royal porch here, which was the royal porticos. Jesus would have preached in the court of the Gentiles, which surrounded the this altar, and basically it only was recent times that they actually discovered evidence for this. But this porch was, beautifully porticoed. Lastly, we have the Mount of Olives, which I needed to mention, and that was a ridge on the hills east of Jerusalem, and so where they made olives is actually aptly named. So anyway, and I think this is probably going to be the end of the video. So I want to thank you again for listening and watching, and I hope you learned some really interesting history and that you were able to relax. Anyway, I hope you have a lovely week ahead, and I hope to be back to my normal schedule starting this week, so expect another video sometime very soon.